There are places in this world where silence is not peace, but a warning, and when a man in Ohio bought a forgotten farmhouse that had stood for nearly 2 centuries, he believed he was purchasing quiet solitude. What he inherited instead was a secret the town had buried so deeply that even its own history had forgotten it. Imagine walls breathing with the weight of concealed crimes, stones stacked not for shelter, but for denial. The moment workers began hammering at the bricked-off basement, a smell crept out from the cracks, heavy damp sweet with the rot of decades. It was the smell of time itself refusing to stay buried. This house was never just a house. It was a tomb, a vault where truth had been chained and locked away for 91 years. And what lingered within was not just decay, but evidence of betrayal and blood, the kind of evidence entire communities conspire to silence. The man thought he had found a project, a place to restore for weekends and family gatherings. Instead, he had purchased an initiation, a descent into history's cruelest test. He was about to discover that silence is not the absence of truth, but its camouflage. And when the bricks fell and the light pierced that forbidden room, he would awaken the ghost of a man who called himself a physician, but was in truth something far more dangerous. A predator cloaked in authority, a killer dressed as a healer. This was no accident of architecture, no strange renovation choice. The basement had been sealed because its story was poison, and if you listen closely, you will hear the warning in the hammer strikes that cracked open the wall, the sound of history demanding to be heard. What lay beyond that barrier was not only furniture and dust, it was the residue of suffering, and the physical record of crimes so coldly methodical, they blurred the line between medicine and murder. A table stained with what looked like dried blood ruments that gleamed once under lantern-light jars that once preserved human flesh, and a leather-bound journal written in a precise hand, a record of each victim like entries in a ledger of sacrifice. This is where our descent begins, not with whispers of ghost stories, but with the suffocating weight of truth, a truth Ohio tried to bury, but the earth itself refused to keep. The farmhouse stood on land that was once frontier soil, blood-soaked long before its foundations were ever poured. The trees that surrounded it swayed like silent witnesses, their roots tangled in memories no man had the courage to name, and within those walls, history had not passed, but congealed into a kind of malignant presence, the kind you do not sense until you are too deep to turn back. The man who built the house was not remembered by name in the county records, at least not in the way you would expect. His reputation was cleaned and polished by polite society. Yet whispered lore painted him as something darker. He was called a physician, a man who promised healing, but his patients never seemed to return to their families. Instead, their names dissolved into silence while his practice grew. His wealth expanded, and his influence spread like a shadow over the community. Neighbors claimed he was eccentric, brilliant even, but at night, faint lights glowed from the farmhouse windows. Long after midnight, faint cries carried across the fields, and the occasional smell of burning flesh drifted through the air. The community ignored it because power blinds the weak, and in those days, a man with wealth could commit sins in plain sight so long as he paid his dues to the church and offered his coin to local leaders. But behind the farmhouse door, truth was festering. The doctor used his basement as a laboratory of human cruelty. He experimented with the dying and the desperate, with orphans and travelers, with the weak who had no one to defend them. He promised healing and gave only torment. Some said he sought to conquer death itself. Some said he was searching for the secret of the soul. Others whispered he was no mere man, but an initiate of an older order, an order that demanded offerings and flesh. For decades, this place functioned as both sanctuary and slaughterhouse until something went wrong. Perhaps a patient escaped. Perhaps a servant spoke too much. Perhaps the townsfolk saw one. Horror too many. Whatever it was, the walls were sealed. The doctor vanished from record, and the farmhouse passed from hand to hand until it rotted in silence. But silence cannot erase memory. Silence cannot erase sin. And now, with the bricks collapsing, the truth began to seep out again, reaching for the living, with icy fingers whispering that history is never finished, it only waits. buried beneath layers of denial, until someone bold or foolish enough tears down the walls. When the new owner purchased the farmhouse, he believed he was buying nothing more than an old relic of Ohio's rural past. The sagging roof, the faded paint, the echoing hallways all seemed to him merely a challenge for restoration, a way to carve a life from history. But some houses do not belong to the living. They belong to the memories that built them. They belong to the secrets layered within their foundations, and this house was one of them. It did not take long for the unease to set in. The nights felt heavy, the silence unnatural, the kind of silence that presses against the ears until it feels like a roar. Small things went missing. Tools, furniture, objects he could swear he had placed carefully would be found somewhere else, and the smell of dampness in the house was unlike any he had known. It was not the smell of water, but of something old, rotting, stagnant, as though the walls themselves were decaying from within. Neighbors told him casually over fences, and at the local diner, that there was a reason the farmhouse sold so cheaply. The last few owners had left quickly, some in the middle of the night. One couple abandoned their belongings entirely, leaving furniture, clothing, even family photographs, as though fleeing from something unseen. But no one ever explained why their faces always tightened at the mention of the house, as if to speak aloud. What lingered there was to invite it closer. One evening while repairing the cellar steps, he noticed the wall did not sound right when struck with a hammer hollow, where there should have been stone. His curiosity turned to obsession. For nights, he stared at that wall, convinced something waited behind it, and when he finally began to chip away, the plaster fell like flakes of ancient skin. The bricks beneath were carefully arranged, solid, deliberate, as though meant not to support, but to conceal. The discovery filled him with a dread he could not soothe. This was not a structural fix. This was an intentional burial. Someone long ago had wanted to keep that basement sealed from the world, not for safety, but for secrecy. It was a message across time, that what lay behind was never meant to be touched. But curiosity is stronger than fear, and he continued until his hands were raw, and the bricks began to crumble, and what seeped through the cracks was not just dust, but a stench so foul it carried with it the memory of death. The air that spilled out of the broken bricks felt alive. It wrapped around him with a suffocating grip, carrying the weight of years that had been sealed away. It was not just the smell of decay, but something heavier, almost metallic, as though the air itself had been steeped in blood. The lantern light flickered against the dust cloud, and for a moment he swore the shadows moved faster than the flame. When the final layer of bricks gave way, the space revealed itself not as a simple storage room, but as something older and more deliberate. The stone floor was stained in patterns that time could not erase. Streaks and circles darker than the rest, as though liquid had once pooled there again and again. The walls bore marks too, not from tools of construction, but from fingernails dragging deep gouges into the stone, desperate marks of someone clawing for escape. At the center of the room sat objects that seemed impossibly out of place. A wooden chair bolted into the ground, its arms and legs reinforced with rusted iron loops, as though meant to restrain more than hold a small table beside it, littered with tools long corroded, yet still sharp enough to suggest their use and scattered across the floor. Tiny bones, fragile and brittle. Some animal, perhaps, yet too small and too human in shape to be dismissed with comfort. He tried to tell himself this was the work of time, perhaps a space used for storage or livestock, but the arrangement of the room denied all such excuses. Everything was too precise, too intentional. The bolts, the stains, the markings. No farmer would build such a place for animals, and no family would use their home as a prison unless they were hiding something unspeakable. The more he stared, the more he felt the basement staring back. It was as if the room itself carried memory, and that memory was not silent. He could almost hear the faint echoes of cries swallowed by the stone weiss, purrs that brushed the edge of hearing a sound like breathing behind his neck. Even though he stood alone, his hands shook, but he could not stop himself from stepping deeper into the chamber, because within the terror was also a calling, a voice unspoken that told him this discovery was only the beginning. And once awakened, the house would not allow him to turn away. The deeper he moved into the bricked-off chamber, the more the air seemed to press against his chest, as though the room itself resented his intrusion. The lantern flame wavered not from his trembling hands, but as if something unseen brushed past it. Deliberately, the silence grew unbearable. It was no longer the quiet of an empty space, but the waiting stillness of something that had been disturbed. On the far wall he saw a strange symbol carved into the stone. It was not the mark of a mason, nor the idle scrawl of children. It was deliberate symmetrical jagged lines converging into a circle burned into the stone, as though etched with heat. The grooves were blackened and charred untouched by the passing years. What unsettled him most was that the design seemed fresh, as though someone had cut it only days before. Beside the symbol rested a box covered in dust, its wood swollen with age, yet the lock was strong and unbroken. He hesitated to touch it. Every instinct warned him that opening it would not be an act of curiosity, but of invitation. Yet his curiosity clawed harder than his fear. He pried it open, and inside were objects that felt alive, though they were lifeless trinkets. Scraps of fabric stained dark with time, a broken comb, a child's shoe no bigger than the palm of his hand, and a set of teeth loose and yellowed wrapped in cloth. The sight made his skin crawl. But what disturbed him even more was the realization that these were not random keepsakes. They were trophies, offerings perhaps, tokens left behind not to be forgotten, but to bind something within the walls, something that fed on memory and flesh, something the builders of the bricks had hoped to contain. As he stared down at the box, a sound echoed faintly through the chamber. It was not the creak of wood or the settling of stone. It was the sound of weeping, faint and distant, yet unmistakably real. It did not belong to any living person above him. It came from within the walls themselves, as though the stone still held the sorrow of those who had suffered here. He backed away, clutching the lantern, his pulse racing, but the room did not release him. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a descent, a spiral that had only now begun to pull him into its center. When he climbed back toward the main floor of the farmhouse, he thought leaving the basement behind would lessen the pressure in his chest. But the opposite happened. The house seemed heavier, as if the walls themselves had listened to his trespass, and now weighed upon him like watchful eyes. The once quiet farmhouse now whispered with unfamiliar sounds. The faint scratch of something moving in the rafters, the almost imperceptible shuffle across the wooden floorboards when he stood still long enough to notice, and a low vibration that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself that old houses always breathed with age. Wood contracted stone. Shifted mice made homes in hidden places. But the memory of the box and its strange contents refused to leave his mind. His thoughts replayed the image of the child's shoe, the teeth, the scraps of stained fabric until they no longer felt like relics, but warnings, each one screaming silently to turn back. In the kitchen, he discovered something he had not seen before, a long crack in the plaster of the wall, faint but extending in a jagged path up toward the ceiling. The edges of the crack were not sharp, like damage from time. They were smoothed, as if deliberately carved into the shape of something a design half revealed, though still hidden. He ran his fingers across it and felt warmth pulsing faintly beneath the surface, as though the wall itself carried a heartbeat. At that moment, a gust of cold air rushed through the house, though every window was shut and the door bolted tight. It extinguished the lantern and plunged the farmhouse into a darkness so complete, it felt almost solid, pressing against his skin and whispering against his ear. He could hear something then clearer than ever. The same faint weeping he had heard in the basement. Only now, it was not distant. It was inside the house with him. His breath quickened. He reached for matches, his hands fumbling. But when the light finally flickered back, the shadows in the room did not scatter. They only deepened, hanging longer and darker than any flame should allow. And within them, he thought he saw movement shapes just out of reach, waiting just beyond the fragile circle of light. The house was no longer just a place of silence and memory. It was awake. The night that followed was unlike any other, for, as he tried to sleep upstairs, the farmhouse shifted and moaned like a body restless with fever. Each creak of the floorboards below, each sudden thump against the walls carried the rhythm of intention. Not chance it was, as if someone or something walked the halls, pacing, waiting, measuring the weight of his presence. He kept the lantern burning by his bedside, its weak glow his only shield against the suffocating dark. But even with light around him, the shadows stretched unnaturally, curling up the walls like vines seeking to claim him. In their slow, inevitable grip, he turned his head once and thought he saw the faint silhouette of a figure crouched at the far corner of the room, its limbs bent at wrong angles. But when he blinked, it was gone, leaving only the sound of shallow breaths that were not his own. Sleep refused him, and as the hours stretched, the house seemed to grow hungrier. With each passing moment, the whispers returned, carried on the unseen draft. Weaving words he could almost understand, a name repeated softly over and over, Callahan, but in a tone filled not with love, but with contempt, as if the very structure of the farmhouse remembered and despised its builders. Driven by a mixture of dread and obsession, he left his bed in the dead of night and descended once again toward the locked basement door. He felt certain now that what lay beneath was not a mere relic of time, but a truth sealed away intentionally, like a wound sutured too tight beneath layers of stone. As he pressed his ear against the wooden frame, he heard the faint scrape of fingernails against stone. From the other side, slow, deliberate, as if whoever lingered there knew he was listening. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to abandon the farmhouse before it swallowed him whole, but some darker compulsion rooted his feet to the ground. He could not leave now, not we. The house had opened itself to him, not when its secrets pressed so close that they breathed against his skin. As dawn's first weak light crept through the broken curtains, he realized he had spent the entire night listening to the whispers and scratching, never once closing his eyes. The house had claimed its first victory over him, not through violence, but by bending his will. The morning sun did little to ease the weight pressing down upon him, for the light outside seemed weaker than it should have been, as though the air itself resisted clarity. The farmhouse held on to the night as if day could never truly reach it. Shadows clung stubbornly to the corners, refusing to retreat, and the smell of damp earth now carried the sour edge of rot. He stumbled into the kitchen searching for distraction, only to find a strange object resting on the table, where he was certain nothing had been left before it was a child's wooden toy, carved crudely and darkened with age. A spinning top etched with symbols he could not recognize. The carvings looked less like decoration and more like marks made with purpose, as though they formed part of a language hidden from the uninitiated. When he touched it, the wood felt unnaturally cold, a chill seeping into his palm that made his veins tighten. Questions spiraled within him. Who had placed it there? How had it surfaced? What connection did it have to the bricked-off cellar below? The toy spun once on its own across the scarred wood of the table, and he nearly cried out, though no breath escaped his throat. It wobbled, then fell on its side, pointing unmistakably toward the basement door like a compass to its true north. In that moment he understood the house was not passively haunted. It was deliberate. It was orchestrating events to lead him deeper, pulling at his curiosity like strings tied to a puppet, and he could not pretend any longer that what was happening was random. He spent the day wandering the farmhouse searching for other objects that might have been left behind, remnants of whoever or whatever had once lived here in an upstairs closet. He found a bundle of letters tied together with brittle ribbon. Though the ink had long faded, one word repeated across several pages over and over again. Redemption, yet written in a hand that grew shakier with each letter, as though the writer had been fighting despair with every stroke. By the time the sun began to set once more, the toy still lay on the kitchen table, and every time he passed it, he felt its silent demand return. Go to the basement. The message was unmistakable. The farmhouse had begun to strip away his resistance piece by piece. That night he did not sleep, though he lay on the mattress with his eyes shut, pretending to rest. He could feel the pressure of the house surrounding him like unseen hands pressing gently at first, then with greater force urging him to give in to its will. Every creak of the floorboards above, every sigh of the wind against the shutters, carried the same message. Descend to where the truth is kept. At 3 a.m, the sound began again, the hollow rhythmic knocking from beneath the floor. It was slower now, like a heartbeat, deliberate, measured, insistent. He rose without hesitation and lit a lantern. His hands trembled as he carried it through the hall. But his steps were steady. The toy still lay on the kitchen table, and as the light touched it, the top spun once more, guiding him toward the basement door. He gripped the knob, the brass colder than ice, and when he turned it, the door opened easily, as though the resistance from before had been nothing more than a test. He descended the first few steps, the air heavy with moisture. The lantern light revealed cobwebs stretched across beams and the glimmer of stone below. Halfway down the stairs, he stopped because he realized the knocking had ceased. It had been replaced by something else. A low vibration in the walls, like the faint hum of a distant choir. Though no words could be understood, the sound stirred unease deep in his bones, as if awakening a memory he did not possess. At the bottom of the stairs, the bricked wall waited its presence undeniable. It seemed larger than before, the bricks darkened by age and streaked with something that might have been rust, or something far worse. He lifted the lantern higher, and for the first time noticed faint markings carved into the mortar between the bricks, the same symbols etched on the spinning top, repeating over and over like a chant meant to seal something away. He reached out with one hand, ushing the carvings, and felt heat radiating from them, as though the wall itself had a pulse. The sensation was so unnatural it forced him back a step. The farmhouse had revealed its secret and yet refused him entry, holding him in a state of torment. The truth was within reach, but still beyond his grasp. The next morning he tried to convince himself it had been nothing more than exhaustion and imagination, brought on by long hours and the isolation of the countryside, yet the marks on his fingertips told a different story. Faint burns where he had touched the mortar, the skin tender, as if branded by something alive. The spinning top no longer sat idle on the table. It had rolled to the edge and balanced impossibly there, waiting for him to notice, determined to understand. He went into town seeking records at the county courthouse, dusty ledgers and property deeds piled high in wooden cabinets. He searched for mention of the Holloway farmstead. Tracing its history back through generations, the name of Thomas Holloway appeared first, then Marcus and Sarah, but in a faded book nearly lost to mildew, he found an earlier entry, one that spoke of a purchase from the government land office in 1798, and beneath it a handwritten note in the margin sealed cellar not to be disturbed. The clerk who helped him locate the volume grew uneasy when asked about the note. His face paled and he shook his head, saying best not to go prying into old matters. Some things were built for reasons better left unspoken. Pressed further, he only muttered that people once whispered of experiments during the cholera years, and that entire families had been warned to keep away from the Holloway land. Returning to the farmhouse, he carried more questions than answers. The walls seemed to sense his intrusion. For the knocking resumed the moment he crossed the threshold. This time louder, more insistent, echoing up through the boards of the parlor. The vibration rattled dishes in the cupboard and set dust drifting from the rafters, as if the house itself had grown impatient. He went again to the basement door, lantern in hand, determined to uncover what lay beyond the bricks. Yet when he reached for the knob, it resisted turning cold, and rigid as if locked from the other side. Then the top spun violently on the floor beside him, faster than he had ever seen whirring, until it collapsed in silence, pointing directly toward the bricked wall, as if declaring that his choice had already been made. He began the work at dawn, dragging his grandfather's old tools down the cellar steps. Each strike of the hammer against the bricks rang like a funeral bell echoing through the hollow space. The air grew heavy with dust and an odor that was not simply earth, but something older, damp, and metallic. The scent of iron and rot seeped into his lungs, making every breath a struggle. The wall was built with unusual precision, each brick layered with a mortar that resisted more than it should have, as though the builders had meant for it never to be undone. Still, hour after hour, he chipped and pried until a crack opened wide enough to release a draft of air, so cold it froze the sweat on his skin. It carried with it a faint whisper, not imagined, but real words. He could almost make out carried through the narrow opening. Driven by both fear and obsession, he widened the gap until he could force his lantern inside. The light revealed not earth or stone, but a corridor leading deeper beneath the farmhouse. narrow walls lined with limestone slick with condensation. He ducked through the opening, and the sound of the house above seemed to vanish, replaced by a pulsing silence, like being inside the body of something alive. The corridor ended in a chamber, its ceiling low, its walls covered in strange markings carved deep into the stone. They resembled medical diagrams, but twisted skeletal shapes, spines bent backwards, skulls dissected and displayed like symbols of anatomy and ritual. Combined in the center of the chamber stood a table stained black from countless uses, its surface scarred by blades and fire. Around the walls were shelves filled with jars of liquid. Inside them floated organs suspended in murky fluid. Eyes, heart's fragments of lungs, each jar labeled in a precise hand, the same handwriting he had seen in the leather-bound journal. Names and dates stretching back to 1832. Every patient listed every one marked deceased. The lantern flame flickered as if struggling against the weight of the chamber. Shadows moved though no one else was there. And from somewhere deep within the stone came the unmistakable sound of breathing slow and deliberate, as though the room itself had lungs. He stood frozen, the lantern shaking in his hand, as the sound of breathing grew louder and deeper. The shelves of jars seemed to tremble, as though vibrating to the rhythm of that unseen presence. His mind screamed to flee, yet his legs carried him forward, drawn by some force stronger than reason. The table at the center of the chamber radiated a chill so intense that frost clung to the edges of its surface, despite the damp warmth of the underground air. Upon the table lay a bundle wrapped in decayed cloth, the fabric brittle and eaten through with age, yet it pulsed faintly, as if something within still carried life. He reached out against his own will and touched the cloth. It was warm, not with the heat of decay, but the steady warmth of flesh. As his fingers brushed it, the lantern flame dimmed and the breathing stopped, replaced by a sudden sharp exhale, as though the chamber itself had awakened. The markings on the walls seemed to glow faintly, their edges shimmering with a pale light. The carvings no longer looked like diagrams, but like restraints, diagrams of bodies forced into poses of pain, their limbs bound and their mouths open in endless screams. He staggered back, but the chamber gave no path of retreat. The corridor he had entered was swallowed in shadow, the doorway gone replaced by a solid wall of stone. The cloth began to unravel on its own strands, falling away to reveal what lay within. It was not a body as he had feared, but a collection of bones bound together with wire and string, each piece taken from a different person. A rib from one, a jaw from another, a hand stitched to an arm that was too long and too slender to belong to the same body. It was a patchwork skeleton built from victims, an artifact of both medical ambition and unspeakable cruelty. As the final piece of fabric fell away, the jaw of the skeleton clicked open, as though it were trying to speak its empty sockets. La walked onto him, and the chamber filled with a sound not human, not animal, but a deep resonant hum vibrating in his skull, until he thought his head would split. The jars rattled on their shelves, some crashing to the floor, releasing the stench of ancient fluids. The bones on the table shifted slightly, as if preparing to rise. The hum grew stronger, vibrating through the floor and up into his body, until it felt like his bones might crack under the pressure. He tried to shout, but no sound left his throat, only a strangled gasp that was swallowed by the air. The skeleton on the table twitched its limbs, jerking in unnatural angles like a puppet, controlled by invisible strings. Each snap of wire echoed like the crack of a whip in the silence of the chamber. Then came the smell, thick and overpowering. The stench of rot mixed with the metallic tang of blood, as though the walls themselves were bleeding. His lantern flickered violently. Shadows surged across the chamber, forming shapes that seemed far too deliberate to be illusions. Faces, mouths open in silent screams, arms stretching out as though clawing their way from the stone itself. He staggered back, pressing himself against the cold wall. But the wall shifted beneath him, as if it too were alive. The skeleton's jaw clattered again, this time forming syllables, broken fragments of words in a voice that sounded like many voices at once. Whispers layered upon screams, each one recognizable as human, yet impossible to identify. Together, they chanted his name. How did it know his name? He had never spoken it aloud in this place, and yet the dead knew him. They were calling him as if he had been expected. The table shuddered beneath the weight of the abomination. The wires snapped one by one, but instead of collapsing, the bones fused together by something unseen, marrow knitting into marrow sinew, forming where there should have been none. The figure rose, its empty socket still fixed on him, its jaw unhinging further than human anatomy would allow, until it gaped like a cavern, and from within poured a sound so low and deep it seemed to shake the very foundation of the earth. And then the lantern went out, plunging him into absolute darkness, where only the sound of the breathing, the humming, and the clatter of moving bones remained. The darkness pressed down like a living weight, suffocating every thought and crushing every instinct that begged him to flee. But his legs would not move. It was as if the air itself had wrapped chains around him, holding him captive, in the chamber of horrors. The sound of the breathing grew closer, and with it, the unmistakable scrape of bone against stone, a hollow shuffle that drew nearer with every heartbeat. He raised his hand in the pitch black, fumbling for the lantern, but his fingers brushed only cold stone, slick with something wet. The smell grew stronger, more pungent, like spoiled meat mixed with chemicals that stung his nostrils and burned the back of his throat. He gagged, but no sound escaped. The chamber swallowed it whole. Silence had become the voice of the dead. Then the humming began again, this time inside his own skull, vibrating through his teeth, rattling his jaw until he thought it might splinter apart. Images flashed across his mind, faces twisted in agony, eyes wide with betrayal, mouths locked in screams that had never been heard. These were not strangers. They felt familiar, as if their pain had been woven into his very blood, their stories embedded in the marrow of his bones. A cold hand brushed his shoulder, skeletal fingers grazing across his flesh with deliberate precision. He spun wildly, but there was nothing, only the sound of retreating footsteps echoing away from him. Deeper into the chamber, he realized in that instant that the creature, the abomination that had risen from the table, was not retreating. It was leading him further in, drawing him toward something he had not yet seen, something worse than bones and whispers, something the wall had been built to contain, not just to hide. And then in the silence between his pounding heartbeats, he heard it, a voice older than the earth itself, speaking in tones that belonged to no living tongue. A command spoken not with words, but with raw power, demanding him to step forward into the abyss. The command reverberated through his veins, dragging his body forward, though every part of him screamed to resist. His boots scraped against the stone floor as if pulled by invisible strings, his arms heavy, his chest constricted like a vice around his lungs. The lantern finally sparked with a weak glow, illuminating the chamber, and what it revealed nearly tore his sanity apart. The walls were no longer bare. They pulsed as if alive, veins of black and crimson crawling across the surface, beating like a heart in rhythm with his own. The brick that had been pried loose was not the only opening. It was merely the first wound in a much larger body that seemed to awaken. The deeper he moved into the space, carved symbols burned faintly across the living stone, twisting and shifting, as if mocking his attempt to read them. And though he could not understand them, he knew instinctively they were commands, invitations, bargains, etched in languages designed to enslave. At the center of the chamber stood a pit, its edges jagged as though clawed open from the inside. Shadows bled out of it, not cast by the lantern, but seeping like smoke, twisting upward and vanishing into the ceiling. The sound of breathing returned stronger now, echoing from the pit itself. But it was not one voice. It was many a chorus of suffering trapped together, woven into a single endless exhale. He stumbled closer, unable to resist, though terror raged in his chest. He peered into the darkness below, and saw movement, not of one figure, but countless arms clawing upward, skeletal hands, reaching fingers curling desperate to drag him in their faces, remained obscured in the blackness, yet their cries pierced his mind, begging, cursing, commanding and pleading all at once, until he no longer knew which voice was his own. The bricked wall had not been built to conceal a family secret. It had been a seal, a desperate attempt to lock this abyss away. Roam the world, but time had weakened it, and his curiosity had broken it entirely. Now he stood on the edge of a wound that should never have been opened, and the thing within was no longer contained. The pit stirred as if it recognized him. The shadows rippled, and the cries turned into whispers, threading through his skull like poisoned silk. They spoke his name, though he had never given it aloud. They spoke of his childhood of nights. He thought no one remembered of sins he thought were buried deeper than his own memory. Yet here they were recited back to him one after another, until the weight of his existence felt like chains dragging him closer to the edge. The lantern flame sputtered the air, thickened with a smell that was neither rot nor smoke, but something older, something that clung to the lungs and poisoned thought itself. He gripped his chest, fighting for breath, but the whispers promised relief. If only he would descend. They told him the pain he carried, the failures, the betrayals, all could be rewritten if he surrendered, if he stepped willingly into their abyss. The voices overlapped until they became one smooth and commanding, offering him freedom, in exchange for his soul. For a fleeting moment, he considered it not with desire, but with exhaustion. The idea of silence, the idea of no longer being haunted by regrets, it nearly pulled him forward. Yet another sound cut through the darkness, a low moan rising not from the pit, but from the walls themselves. The pulsating stone seemed to weep, black ichor dripping toward the floor, as if the chamber itself mourned what was about to unfold. He staggered back, but the invisible force shoved him forward again. The whispers grew sharp, their promises turned to threats. They told him the world above was already claimed, that his fate was never his to choose, that he was simply a vessel called here to continue the pact made generations ago. And though he resisted, though his body trembled in rebellion, he felt his will slipping like water through a clenched fist. The edge of the pit was before him, its void swallowing the lantern light, its hunge re-palpable in the air. The whispers softened again, tender, almost parental, promising that he would finally understand that stepping forward meant becoming more than human, meant joining those who whispered from beyond. Yet in his heart, he knew there was no ascension, only consumption, and he stood trembling on the border of surrender. The void below breathed like a living beast, inhaling and exhaling, as though it had a heart of fire buried deep within. And as he gazed into it, the visions came unbidden. They were not dreams and not memories, but fragments of other lives, faces that bore his own eyes, men who had stood at this same edge, women who had whispered the same promises, children who had been born only to be swallowed by this lineage of damnation. He realized then that this was not his first time here. It had never been anyone's first time here. The pit was eternal, and it had been calling bloodlines like his for centuries. The voices grew louder, their tones shifting from persuasion to command. They accused him of weakness, of delay. They mocked his fear, reminding him that resistance was a child's game, and that men like him existed only to bend to power. Their words rang with the authority of institutions he had once trusted. Governments, churches, bloodlines that claimed to guide humanity, but in truth, had always served the hunger beneath the stone. His stomach twisted as he felt the weight of every lie that had ever been told to mankind funnel into his body like chains of smoke tightening around his ribs. Suddenly, the pit showed him the truth of the farmhouse itself. It was not built to protect the world from what lay below. It was built as a beacon, as a feeding ground, a place where those chosen by fate or corruption would be drawn in, one by one, generation after generation. Each soul, a sacrifice, each body, a vessel, each mind broken and rewritten, until nothing human remained. He staggered at the realization that the walls he thought were prison were in fact an altar. The air thickened to the point where every breath felt like swallowing fire, yet his body moved forward against his will. His knees bent as though bowing to an unseen monarch. He clenched his teeth, but his lips began forming words. Not his own syllables, in. A language older than stone, older than blood. The pit trembled in response. The voices harmonized into one almighty roar of anticipation, and in that instant, as his mouth betrayed him and his soul seemed to unravel, he knew there was no line between himself and the abyss. He was not separate from it. He was its continuation. He was the echo of every man who had stood where he now stood. He was not fighting for survival. He was fighting against inevitability. The pit no longer waited. It surged upward, swallowing the silence of the farmhouse. The air split with a roar that was not heard with the ears but felt in the marrow like the shattering of 1,000 unseen chains. He clutched the earth beneath him. Yet the ground itself writhed as though it had grown impatient of serving as the prison wall. The stones cracked and the boards overhead groaned, the entire house above trembling like a body, resisting its final death rattle. The vision sharpened until there was no separation between past, present, and what was still to come. He saw men in black coats carrying torches into this place. In 1830, he saw women dressed in mourning kneeling before the sealed wall. In 1892, he saw the last owner who had dared break the bricks in 1914, only to vanish without a trace, and he saw himself kneeling here in the present, yet also kneeling in other centuries. Always the same soul, always repeating the cycle. The pit was not a place, it was a pattern, a design woven into the very fabric of power. The voices returned, but now they did not whisper or command. They celebrated. They announced him as though he were the awaited heir. And in that celebration, he understood the cruelest truth of all. The bricked wall had never been meant to keep men safe from the abyss. It had been meant to keep the abyss safe from men. Until the right one arrived, until the chosen one returned to unlock it. The secret was not that something monstrous had been buried here. The secret was that something monstrous had been waiting to be born again through him. His mouth opened wide not by choice, and a cry poured out, a cry that was his, and yet not his. A sound that reverberated up through the house, through the soil, through the trees above, until it spread across the Ohio fields like a storm with no clouds. The farmhouse shuddered, and for an instant, he saw it not as wood and brick, but as a cathedral, a sacrifice erected in honor of the abyss, and he knew then that every brick was a prayer, every nail a covenant, every drop of paint, a seal in a contract older than the nation itself, and as the last of his resistance broke as his body yielded to the weight of history, he saw the truth with a clarity that pierced his soul. The farmhouse was never cursed. It was consecrated. It was never abandoned. It was always occupied not by those who lived there, but by the thing that lived through them. And now as the abyss consumed his voice, his body, his name, he felt the walls closing, not to shut him out, but to shut him in. Sealing the cycle once again, until the next man stumbled upon the house in Ohio that had been bricked off for 91 years.